They continued through the dense forest, their steps careful and measured. Every crack of a branch underfoot, every rustle of leaves, made Aylin's heart race. But they pressed on. The night was quiet, the stars shining brightly above, but Aylin couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The alien hunters could still be out there, hunting them, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The further they traveled, the more Aylin realized just how far they had come. The planet they were on was wild and untamed, far from the cities and technology she had known her entire life. It was a strange feeling, to be so disconnected from everything she had once known. But it was also freeing. The planet's harshness mirrored the battles they had fought, a place that didn't care who they were or where they came from. It was just survival, pure and simple. As dawn broke, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, Aylin began to feel the weight of exhaustion. Her body ached, and her mind was clouded with the strain of the journey. But they couldn't stop now. The outpost was close. She could see the faint outline of a structure on the horizon, a small beacon of hope in the wilderness. When they finally reached the outpost, Aylin almost collapsed from relief. The structure was old, its walls cracked and overgrown with vines, but it was solid. It would provide the shelter they needed. Ethan quickly checked the surroundings, making sure there were no immediate threats before ushering Aylin inside. The interior was dark, dust and cobwebs filling the air, but it was a place to rest. It was a place to breathe. Aylin sank onto the floor, her muscles finally giving in to the exhaustion. Ethan moved quickly, checking the outpost's old supply caches, looking for anything they could use. The building was abandoned, but there were still a few basic supplies. Rations, old medical kits, and some weapons. Nothing fancy, but it was enough to keep them alive for a while. Ethan knelt beside her, his eyes softening as he noticed her condition. "You need to rest," he said gently. "I'll keep watch." Aylin shook her head, trying to sit up. "I'm fine. We can't afford to rest for too long." Ethan raised an eyebrow, but didn't argue. He knew she was right. They couldn't let their guard down completely. But he could see the toll the journey had taken on her. She had pushed herself beyond her limits, and he had been there every step of the way, fighting beside her, protecting her. "I'll take the first watch," he said, his voice firm. "You need sleep, just a few hours. We've earned it." Aylin hesitated, but the exhaustion finally caught up with her. Her eyelids grew heavy, and the pain in her side seemed to dull as her body gave in to the much-needed rest. Ethan stood watch, his rifle ready, eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. Hours passed in a blur. The sun climbed higher in the sky, and Aylin's body slowly began to recover. When she finally awoke, the pain was still there, but it was more manageable. She could think clearly again. She could move without feeling like her limbs would give out beneath her. Ethan was still standing watch, his eyes focused on the horizon. As Aylin stood up, he turned to her with a faint smile. "You're awake. How do you feel?" "Better," Aylin replied. "Thanks for letting me sleep." Ethan nodded, his gaze returning to the distance. "We need to talk about what comes next." Aylin joined him at the window, looking out at the wild landscape. The forest stretched for miles in every direction, the mountains looming like silent giants in the distance. There was a sense of calm here, but Aylin knew it wouldn't last. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and their enemies would stop at nothing to find them. "What do you think is next?" Aylin asked. Ethan turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "We keep moving. We can't stay here forever. The hunters won't stop, but we can fight back. We have to. We're not alone in this fight." Aylin looked at him, her heart heavy with the weight of their situation. They had survived the worst, but now they had to rebuild. They had to find allies, make new connections, and face whatever threats the galaxy would throw at them. It wouldn't be easy, but she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. "I'm with you," she said, her voice steady. "Whatever comes next, We face it together. A hatch on the ship's side opened, and a figure emerged. The human soldier who stepped out was tall, with short brown hair and a stern expression. His uniform was worn, battle-scarred, and covered in dust. He looked around briefly before spotting Aylin. His face showed no fear, no hesitation. He approached her slowly, his eyes scanning her injuries. Aylin couldn't move, couldn't speak. Her throat was dry, her body too weak to lift even a finger. She felt like a broken animal, stranded in the wild, waiting to be put out of its misery. The human knelt down beside her, his face softening as he noticed the extent of her injuries. He reached out a hand, his voice calm but firm. "Hey, can you hear me?" he asked, his voice rough, but with an odd kindness to it. Aylin stared at him, confused. She had always been taught that humans were weak, that they were nothing compared to the great Zaran warriors. But this one, this human, didn't look afraid. He looked like he wanted to help. The irony of it made her sick to her stomach. "No," she whispered, barely able to form the word. "You should leave me here. I don't need your help." The human looked at her with something resembling pity, and then he did something she didn't expect. He smiled. "You're not the first alien I've met," he said, his voice surprisingly warm. "I'm not going to leave you here to die." Aylin couldn't believe what she was hearing. For a moment, she just stared at him. He was a human, a creature her species had long considered beneath them, yet here he was, offering her the very thing her own people had denied her. Compassion. Her pride, her ego, the years of indoctrination, all of it fought inside her, but it felt hollow now. What was she really fighting for? She had been abandoned, left to die by her own people. The human had no reason to care about her, yet he did. And in that moment, something shifted within her. Perhaps there was more to humanity than she had been taught. Perhaps there was hope, even in the most unlikely places. The human reached into a pouch on his belt, pulling out a small medkit. He began tending to her wounds with careful hands, his voice soft but steady. "You're going to be okay," he said, more to reassure himself than her. "I'm not leaving you. Not yet." Aylin's breath hitched as the pain in her side eased slightly. She had been trained to fight, to conquer, but she had never been taught how to accept help. It was a foreign feeling, one she wasn't sure how to process. As the human continued to treat her wounds, Aylin couldn't help but wonder, was this the start of something new? Something that would change everything she had ever known. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the barren landscape. Aylin could see the red sky above her, slowly fading into the darkness of night. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. She had been lying there for what felt like hours, unable to move or speak, but the human had stayed by her side the entire time. His name, as he had introduced himself earlier, was Commander Ethan Cole. He was a soldier, a fighter from a distant world called Earth. He had fought in wars that Aylin could never imagine, wars against enemies that had been far less merciful than she had been. Yet there he was, helping her. An alien warrior, a soldier of the empire that had destroyed so much of the human resistance. Aylin's mind was racing as she lay there, her body weak, but her thoughts sharp. She had never expected a human to be so kind. She had been taught that humanity was weak, primitive, and only good for being crushed under the heel of the Zaran Empire. But this human was different. He wasn't afraid of her. He didn't even see her as an enemy. At first, she had fought the feeling. She was an elite warrior, raised to destroy and conquer. But as Ethan continued to work, stitching up her wounds and giving her food and water, something inside her began to change. She wasn't sure if it was gratitude or something else entirely, but she couldn't deny it. She was starting to trust him. She hadn't trusted anyone in years, not since the Empire had betrayed her. Her eyes flickered to the wreckage of her ship, still smoking in the distance. It felt like a lifetime ago that she had been in control, the captain of that mighty warship. Now she was nothing. Just a broken soldier, far from home, and surrounded by nothing but the vast emptiness of this unknown world. "You've got to get moving," Ethan said, his voice breaking through her thoughts. "The aliens will be looking for you. We don't have much time." Aylin blinked and slowly turned her head toward him. He was already standing, his rifle slung over his shoulder. He looked focused, his eyes scanning the horizon as he adjusted his gear. Aylin could see the tiredness in his eyes, the burden of having been out here for days on a mission he hadn't planned for. Yet he still hadn't given up on her. It made no sense. Why would he help someone like her? "Where will we go?" she asked quietly, her voice raspy from the dehydration. Ethan turned to face her, offering a small smile. "There's an old research facility about 30 miles from here. I'm betting it's abandoned, but it's our best shot. If we can get there, we'll find supplies and maybe a way off this planet." Aylin's heart sank. 30 miles. Her legs were useless, and every movement sent waves of pain through her body. She could barely walk, let alone travel across this hostile landscape. Her only hope was that Ethan would carry her or provide some other form of assistance. "How will we get there?" she asked, trying to hide the desperation in her voice. "I'll help you," Ethan replied simply. "We'll move slow, but we'll make it. We don't have a choice. If we stay here, we'll both die." Aylin wanted to argue, to push him away and tell him to save himself. But something in her knew he was right. There was no other option. They either moved or they perished. It wasn't just the aliens who posed a threat. There were other dangers on this planet, predators that would devour anything weaker than themselves. With a grimace, Aylin tried to sit up, but the pain in her side was unbearable. She groaned, her vision swimming once again. Ethan was at her side in an instant, steadying her with a firm hand. "You're not ready to move yet," he said, concern in his voice. "I'll carry you." Aylin shook her head, still determined not to appear weak. "I can walk. Just give me a moment." Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he crouched down beside her, offering his back. "You don't have time for pride. Get on my back, and I'll carry you." For a moment, Aylin stared at him. Her pride fought against her desperation, but it was clear there was no other choice. Slowly, she let go of her pride and allowed herself to trust him. She carefully draped her arm over his shoulder, and with his help, she managed to climb onto his back. Ethan stood up effortlessly, carrying her with ease. It wasn't the most graceful way to travel, but it was the only way she could move. As they began their journey, the silence between them was heavy. Aylin's mind was clouded with conflicting thoughts. She had been trained to hate humans, to see them as little more than pests that needed to be eradicated. But now she was depending on one. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and she hated it. Yet she knew deep down that she had no choice. Ethan was the only one who could save her. The terrain was harsh. The ground was uneven, rocky, and filled with sharp ridges. As they moved through the rocky landscape, Aylin could feel every bump and jolt, the pain shooting through her body with each step Ethan took. But she stayed silent, her eyes scanning the horizon, watching for any signs of danger. The planet was eerily quiet, save for the occasional screech of distant creatures. Aylin had heard of the wildlife on this planet before, their teeth sharp enough to tear through metal, their claws able to slice through flesh, like a hot knife through butter. She had fought alien creatures before, but nothing like what could be lurking here. After what felt like hours, they came to a small clearing. Ethan stopped for a brief rest, setting her down gently on a patch of grass. His eyes were scanning the surrounding area, alert for any signs of movement. Aylin could feel the exhaustion creeping up on her. Her body was drained, and every inch of her was screaming for rest. But she knew they couldn't afford to stop for long. "We need to keep moving," Ethan said, breaking the silence. "The longer we stay still, the greater the chance that the aliens will find us." Aylin nodded, though her throat felt dry and sore. She knew he was right. There was no time for rest. The alien forces were coming, and she could feel their presence in the air like a storm on the horizon. They would stop at nothing to find her and finish what they had started. As they continued on, the landscape began to change. The rocky hills gave way to dense forests, the trees towering above them like ancient sentinels. The air was thick with moisture, and the sound of distant creatures echoed through the trees. Aylin couldn't help but shiver, her mind on high alert. There were things out here that weren't human, things she couldn't even begin to understand. Every few minutes, Ethan would stop, scanning the area and listening intently for any signs of movement. Aylin's senses were heightened as well, her eyes darting around nervously. She could hear something in the distance, something large, something that didn't sound friendly. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps broke through the silence. Aylin tensed, her heart racing. She could feel the sweat on her brow, her body rigid with fear. Ethan was already reaching for his weapon, his eyes narrowed in concentration. "Stay quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Aylin nodded, barely breathing as she tried to keep still. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She could hear them now, multiple sets of heavy footfalls, moving quickly toward them. Ethan raised his rifle, his muscles tense. Aylin's breath caught in her throat as the shadows shifted in the distance. Whatever was coming, it was getting closer. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw them. Alien hunters. Their large, hulking forms emerged from the trees, their glowing eyes scanning the area as they moved in for the kill. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed Aylin behind him, taking the defensive stance. The time for quiet was over. The sound of the alien hunters grew louder, their footfalls heavy against the underbrush. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of insects and animals falling silent, as if everything was aware of the danger closing in. Aylin's heart raced, her body still weak from the crash and injuries. The human soldier, Ethan, was her only hope now. She could feel the weight of his protection around her like an invisible shield. Ethan didn't flinch. His eyes were locked on the approaching hunters, his rifle raised, and his stance steady. Aylin could feel his tension, but there was no fear in his eyes. His determination burned brighter than any fear she had ever seen. For a moment, she wondered what it was like to be so confident, to trust in your strength without a second thought. It was something she had never known, not after being betrayed by her own people, not after everything she had seen and done. But Ethan was different. He wasn't looking at her like she was a defeated enemy, like she was someone to be abandoned. He looked at her as though she mattered, like he was willing to risk everything to keep her safe. The irony of it twisted in her chest. Here she was, an elite warrior of the Zaran Empire, lying broken in the dirt while a human, a creature she had been taught to despise, was willing to fight for her life. "Stay behind me," Ethan whispered, his voice barely audible. "I'll take care of this." Aylin barely had time to nod before the alien hunters broke through the trees. They were massive, towering figures with hunched backs and long, sharp claws. Their faces were twisted, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light. The air around them seemed to hum with an eerie energy. They were predators, ruthless, merciless creatures that thrived on fear. But Ethan didn't hesitate. He fired. The shot rang out, the sound echoing through the trees. One of the hunters staggered, its thick, armored skin barely dented by the blast. It let out an angry screech, its claws slashing through the air in a blur of motion. The other two hunters charged forward, their glowing eyes focused on Ethan as they closed in on their prey. Aylin's breath caught in her throat. She had seen combat before, had been in battles where the odds were stacked against her. But she had never seen anything like this. Ethan was outnumbered, and yet he stood his ground, firing with precision, moving with an unnatural calmness. She could see the way his body moved, every muscle tense but controlled, as though this was a fight he had faced 1,000 times before. "Keep moving," Ethan shouted at her, pulling her from her thoughts. "We need to get to the facility. I can't keep this up forever." Aylin's legs wobbled beneath her, her body screaming for rest, but she knew he was right. The longer they stayed, the more likely the hunters would overwhelm them. With Ethan distracting them, she had a chance to escape, to survive. But she needed to move fast. She pushed herself to her feet, gritting her teeth against the pain. Her legs felt weak, like they were made of rubber, but she managed to stagger behind him, her eyes never leaving the fight. Ethan was holding his ground, his rifle blazing in the dim light of the forest, but the hunters were closing in. Aylin could see the fury in their eyes, the hunger for blood. Suddenly, one of the hunters lunged at Ethan, its claws aiming straight for his throat. Aylin's heart stopped, and without thinking, she dove toward him, throwing herself into the path of the creature. "No!" she screamed as she collided with the hunter, knocking it off course. Her body slammed against the creature's thick, armored skin, but it was enough to give Ethan a moment to recover. He fired again, this time hitting the hunter directly in the chest. The creature screeched in pain and collapsed to the ground, its life fading. Aylin lay on the ground, her breath ragged, her chest heaving. The impact had taken everything out of her, but she didn't care. She had just saved Ethan's life. And in doing so, something inside her had shifted. She had felt something she hadn't felt in years, a sense of connection. She wasn't just fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for something more. Ethan reached out, his hand shaking slightly as he helped her to her feet. "You didn't have to do that," he said, his voice full of concern. "You're hurt, Aylin. You could have." "I couldn't let you die," she interrupted, her voice low but firm. She looked into his eyes, seeing the surprise there, but also something else. Respect. The same respect she had once earned from her fellow Zaran soldiers, but never expected from a human. Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression softening. He wasn't a hero. He wasn't some great warrior, but in that moment, Aylin realized he was something far more important. He was a person, someone who cared, and that made him more powerful than anything she had ever known. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice more urgent now. "The others will be here soon. We can't afford to stay and fight." Aylin nodded, knowing he was right. But before they could take another step, she collapsed once more, her vision swimming. The pain in her body was too much to bear, and her strength was fading quickly. She couldn't keep going. She couldn't survive on her own anymore. Ethan knelt beside her, his face hard with determination. "You're not giving up on me now, Aylin," he said firmly. "We've come this far together. I'm not leaving you." He lifted her again, his movements careful but strong. Her head rested against his shoulder, and she allowed herself to close her eyes, knowing he would keep her safe. He was more than just a soldier. He was her lifeline, the one person who hadn't abandoned her when the world had turned its back. They moved through the forest, Ethan carrying her with a strength that seemed impossible given the long hours of travel. But despite the exhaustion, despite the pain, Aylin felt something new building inside her, a sense of hope. She had never felt hope before. Not like this. Not when the weight of her past, of her empire, had crushed her spirit. But now, with Ethan by her side, something had changed. For the first time in what felt like forever, Aylin allowed herself to dream of a future where she could start over, where she didn't have to live in the shadow of the Empire's betrayal. She wasn't just a warrior anymore. She wasn't just a tool for war. She was something more. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely a breath, "for not leaving me behind." Ethan's grip tightened around her. "You don't need to thank me," he replied softly. "I made a promise, and I don't break my promises." The weight of his words settled over her like a warm blanket. In that moment, Aylin realized that she had underestimated humanity. She had underestimated Ethan. It wasn't just his strength that had made him powerful, it was his compassion, and that was something she had never known in her own world. As the two of them made their way through the dense forest, the sound of alien creatures in the distance, the night seemed less dark, less hopeless. Together, they had a chance. Maybe not for a victory, Maybe not for a great triumph, but for survival. And in the end, that was all they needed. The forest around them was alive with danger. Ethan moved quickly through the dense trees, his breath steady, but his pace quickening with every step. Aylin was still on his back, her head resting against his shoulder. She was barely conscious, her body weak from the injuries and exhaustion that seemed to be draining her spirit. The pain was unbearable, but she knew they had to keep moving. There was no other choice. The distant sound of alien creatures echoed through the forest, growing louder with every passing second. The alien hunters were closing in. They had made it this far, but they were far from safe. Aylin's heart pounded in her chest, each beat reminding her of how fragile they were in this unforgiving world. But Ethan was not going to give up. He wouldn't let her die. She could feel the weight of his determination, the way his muscles strained with every step. He wasn't just carrying her. He was carrying the weight of their survival. Aylin had never felt so vulnerable in her life, but there was something about Ethan's strength, something about his unwavering commitment to her, that made her feel alive. Not like she was just a soldier, a weapon to be used and discarded, but as a person who mattered. "I'm not leaving you behind," Ethan muttered under his breath, his voice steady. "Not now. Not ever." Aylin wanted to say something, wanted to thank him for all he had done, but words felt useless. She wasn't sure if she had any left. Instead, she clung to him, her fingers gripping the fabric of his uniform, as if that simple action could somehow hold them together, could stop the world from falling apart. Suddenly, Ethan stopped, his body going rigid as he listened to the sounds of the forest. The hunters were close now, their heavy footfalls vibrating through the ground. The air was thick with tension, and Aylin could feel every nerve in her body screaming for her to run, to escape. But she couldn't. Not like this. Not with the way her body was falling apart. Ethan turned to her, his expression determined, but there was a flicker of concern in his eyes. "I need you to stay awake. We're almost there. Just a little longer, Aylin." Aylin tried to nod, but the darkness was pulling at her, tempting her to slip into unconsciousness. She had to stay awake. She had to help. But her body felt so weak, so drained. She wasn't sure how much longer she could hold on. Suddenly, a loud crack split the air, followed by a shrill screech that sent chills down Aylin's spine. The alien hunters had found them. They were close. Too close. Ethan's eyes snapped to the direction of the sound, and without a second thought, he started running again, his pace faster than ever before. The trees blurred by them as they sprinted through the forest, the sound of their pursuers echoing behind them. Aylin could feel the sharp pain in her side, but she ignored it, forcing herself to stay conscious. Every step Ethan took seemed like an eternity, but he kept moving, faster, harder, as if his very life depended on it. And in a way it did. The research facility was just ahead, its old, crumbling walls barely visible in the dim light. It was their only hope. They had to make it there. Ethan's eyes were fixed on the building in the distance, but even as he pushed forward, Aylin could hear the sounds of their pursuers closing in. The hunters were faster, stronger, and they were relentless. But Ethan wouldn't stop. He couldn't stop. Not while Aylin was depending on him. "Hold on," Ethan said between heavy breaths, his voice strained. "We're almost there." The sight of the facility gave Aylin a surge of hope. It was old, run down, and likely abandoned, but it was their best chance at survival. They had to get inside, find shelter, and regroup. But as they neared the entrance, Aylin saw something that made her heart sink. The doors were locked. The facility had been closed off long ago, and no one had been here for years. Ethan cursed under his breath, his grip tightening around her as he tried to figure out a way to get inside. "Can you open it?" Aylin asked weakly, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan paused, his eyes scanning the old control panel next to the door. "I can try, but I don't know how long it will take. Stay with me." Aylin didn't have the strength to argue. She could barely keep her eyes open, but she trusted him. She had to. Ethan wasn't just a soldier, he was her lifeline. And in that moment, as she felt the pull of unconsciousness, she realized that she cared about him in a way she hadn't cared about anyone in a long time. He had become more than just a protector. He had become someone she could rely on. Someone she could, maybe even call a friend. Ethan's fingers flew across the panel, his mind working quickly to find a way in. The sound of the hunter's screeches was growing louder, closer. They were almost here. Aylin could feel her heart racing, her breath coming in short gasps. They didn't have much time. Finally, with a sharp click, the doors creaked open. Ethan wasted no time. He pulled her inside, slamming the door behind them and locking it with a loud snap. They were safe. For now. But Aylin couldn't relax. She could feel the weight of their situation pressing in on her. The hunters were still out there. They would find a way in. And when they did, they wouldn't stop until they had finished what they had started. Ethan knew it too. His expression was grim as he scanned the room, his rifle still gripped tightly in his hands. "We need to find weapons," Ethan said, his voice low. "And we need to fortify this place. It's only a matter of time before they break in." Aylin nodded, her mind working despite the fog of exhaustion clouding her thoughts. They had to fight. They had no other choice. The hunters were too dangerous, too strong. If they didn't defend themselves, they would be killed, and she wasn't ready to die yet. Not after everything they had been through. Ethan moved quickly, his eyes scanning the old research facility for anything useful. Aylin stayed close behind him, her body barely able to keep up with him, but she pushed through the pain. She had to. There was no room for weakness here. Not anymore. They found an old storage room, its shelves lined with dusty crates and rusty equipment. Ethan opened one of the crates, pulling out a few weapons, but nothing that would help them against the alien hunters. He cursed under his breath, his eyes narrowing as he searched through the shelves. "We need something more powerful," he muttered, frustration building in his voice. "These weapons won't do." Aylin's mind was racing, trying to think of a way out. They couldn't fight the hunters on their own. They didn't have enough firepower, but she had seen their technology. She had seen their weapons. And there was one thing she knew they couldn't afford to miss: an old experimental energy weapon that had been developed long before the Zarin Empire's downfall. "Over there," she said, her voice faint but clear. "In the far corner. There's something. It's our only chance." Ethan's eyes followed her finger, his gaze locking onto the weapon she had pointed out. It was a small, sleek energy rifle, one that had been developed as a prototype. It wasn't perfect, but it was the best option they had. "Good call," he said, quickly grabbing the weapon and checking it over. "This should do the trick." Aylin felt a rush of relief, but it was short-lived. The sound of the alien hunter's screeches was growing louder outside the facility. They were getting closer. Aylin's stomach twisted in fear. They had no time to waste. "We need to be ready," Ethan said, his voice hardening with resolve. "We fight, or we die. There's no other choice." Aylin nodded, her mind clear for the first time in what felt like forever. She wasn't just going to survive. She was going to fight. And she would fight with Ethan. Together, they would face whatever came next. Together, they would escape. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint hum of the energy weapon in Ethan's hands. Sweat trickled down his face, his eyes never leaving the entrance. Aylin sat against the wall, her injuries still aching, but her resolve was clearer than ever. She knew this was it, the moment that would decide everything. There would be no more running, no more hiding. The alien hunters were closing in, and there was nowhere left to escape. Ethan glanced over at Aylin, his expression a mix of determination and concern. He had been through countless battles, but none like this. None where the stakes were so high, where survival wasn't guaranteed. He had seen his fair share of battles, but this was something else entirely. This was not just a fight for survival. It was a fight for their future. Aylin had never seen a human fight like Ethan. She had witnessed strength before, the kind that came from training and experience. But Ethan's strength wasn't just physical. It was something deeper. It was the strength of his spirit, the resolve that burned within him to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. It was something she had never seen before, something she had never understood. But now, as she watched him prepare for the final fight, she realized she was no longer just an observer. She was part of this fight. She was willing to give everything to survive. "They're coming," Ethan muttered, his voice low but steady. His hand tightened around the energy weapon, his knuckles white. "We need to be ready." Aylin nodded, pushing herself to her feet despite the pain in her side. Every step felt like a struggle, but she knew she couldn't afford to slow down. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The hunters were relentless. They would never stop until they had finished what they started. Ethan checked his rifle once more, ensuring the energy cells were fully charged. The rifle hummed in his hands, its sleek black surface reflecting the dim light of the room. He glanced over at Aylin, his eyes meeting hers. There was no fear in his gaze, only the cold certainty of a man who knew what needed to be done. "Stay close," he said. "If we're going to make it out of here alive, we do it together." Aylin didn't need to hear more. She could see the fire in his eyes, and she knew he wasn't going to back down. Neither would she. They had come this far. There was no turning back now. The sound of the hunters' shrieks echoed from the outside, growing louder with each passing second. The ground shook beneath their feet as the alien creatures advanced, their massive forms closing in on the facility. Aylin could hear their guttural growls, their claws scraping against the ground, getting closer and closer. The air was thick with the scent of blood and sweat. "We don't have much time," Ethan said, his voice steady but urgent. "Get ready." Aylin took a deep breath, pushing aside the pain in her body. She wasn't sure how long she could last, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to die quietly. She wasn't going to let these monsters win. The doors of the facility burst open with a loud crash, and the alien hunters poured in, their glowing eyes fixed on their prey. They were faster than anything Aylin had ever seen, their powerful legs propelling them forward with incredible speed. But Ethan was ready. The first hunter lunged, its claws slashing through the air. But Ethan was quicker. He fired, the shot hitting the creature square in the chest. The hunter staggered, screeching in pain, but it didn't stop. It kept coming. "Move," Ethan shouted to Aylin, his voice sharp. He grabbed her arm and pulled her to the side as the second hunter charged. The creature's claws scraped against the walls, leaving deep gashes in the metal. Ethan fired again, hitting the creature in the shoulder, but it didn't even flinch. The hunters were strong, stronger than anything he had ever faced. Aylin didn't hesitate. She grabbed a nearby metal pipe, her fingers slipping but her grip firming as she swung it at the oncoming hunter. The pipe collided with the hunter's face with a sickening crunch, but it only seemed to anger the creature further. It let out a deafening roar, swinging its claws wildly. Aylin ducked just in time, but the creature's claws grazed her arm, and she cried out in pain. Ethan fired again, his aim true, and the hunter dropped to the ground with a final screech. But the battle wasn't over. There were still more. So many more. "Keep moving," Ethan yelled, pulling Aylin toward the far side of the room. They needed to find cover, somewhere they could regroup. The hunters were too many, and they couldn't fight them all head-on, but they could fight smart. They reached a small alcove in the far corner of the room, and Ethan quickly set up a defensive position, his rifle aimed at the door. Aylin leaned against the wall, her chest heaving, as she tried to catch her breath. Blood dripped from the wound on her arm, but she didn't have time to worry about that now. They had to hold their ground. The door exploded open again, and the remaining hunters poured in, their glowing eyes burning with fury. They weren't just hunting them now. They were hunting for vengeance. Ethan fired first, his shot ringing out with deadly precision, but the second hunter was already too close. It slammed into him, knocking him to the ground with a roar. Aelin watched in horror as the creature's claws came down, aiming for Ethan's throat. Without thinking, she grabbed the energy rifle and fired. The blast hit the hunter square in the chest, and the creature let out a final screech before collapsing in a heap. But the other hunters weren't far behind. They were closing in fast, and Aelin knew they didn't have much time left. "We have to finish this," she shouted, her voice desperate. Ethan struggled to his feet, wiping the blood from his mouth as he grabbed a grenade from his belt. He didn't have to say anything. Aelin knew what he was thinking. It was all or nothing now. They had no other choice. He tossed the grenade into the middle of the room, the countdown ticking in the air like a death sentence. Aelin and Ethan ran to the far wall, ducking behind a metal panel for cover. The explosion was deafening, the shockwave sending them both crashing to the ground. The room filled with smoke and dust, the air thick with the scent of burning metal. Aelin gasped for air, her head spinning, but she forced herself to stand. The hunters were gone, their bodies charred and scattered across the room. They had done it. They had survived. But there was no time to celebrate. The facility was shaking, the walls creaking under the pressure of the explosion. The hunters were gone for now, but more would come. They had to get out of there. Ethan grabbed Aelin's arm, pulling her to her feet as the building continued to tremble. "We need to move. Now." They stumbled out of the room, their bodies bruised and battered, but alive. They had fought with everything they had, and it had worked. They had won. They had survived. But the war wasn't over. It was just beginning. As they ran toward the exit, Aelin glanced at Ethan, her heart swelling with a sense of gratitude and respect. She had never imagined that a human, someone she had been taught to hate, could become her ally, her protector, and in the end, her friend. Together, they had faced impossible odds and come out on top. But the galaxy was vast, and they knew there were more challenges ahead, more enemies to fight, more battles to win. But for the first time in a long time, Aelin felt something she hadn't felt in years: hope. The escape was a blur of pain, exhaustion, and adrenaline. Ethan and Aelin ran, pushing their bodies past their limits, the shock of their victory still sinking in. They had made it out of the wreckage, the ruins of the alien hunters' assault behind them. The sounds of the crumbling facility faded as they made their way through the dense forest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was silence. But that silence was not comforting. It was heavy, filled with the weight of what they had just gone through, and the uncertainty of what was to come. Aelin leaned against a tree, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion. The pain in her side was unbearable, but she gritted her teeth, refusing to show weakness. They had come so far, fought so hard, and she wasn't about to let it all end now. Not after everything they had been through. Ethan was by her side, his eyes scanning the dark forest for any signs of danger. His face was covered in dirt and blood, but there was a quiet determination in his gaze. He wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. "We're safe for now," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. "But we need to keep moving." Aelin nodded, though every part of her wanted to collapse. Her body screamed for rest, but she knew there was no time for that. The hunters were still out there. Their enemies had been relentless, and the moment they showed any sign of weakness, it would be over. She couldn't afford to slow them down. "I'm not going to stop," Aelin said, her voice hoarse but filled with resolve. "I'm not leaving you." Ethan glanced at her, his expression softening for a moment. "I'm not leaving you either. We'll get through this together." It was strange to hear those words from him. Aelin had spent her life fighting for survival, always alone, always forced to rely on her own strength. But now, in this strange, chaotic moment, she had someone she could trust, someone who had fought beside her, risked everything to keep her alive. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that with Ethan by her side, there was hope. A kind of hope she had long ago forgotten. "Where are we going?" Aelin asked, Looking around at the unfamiliar terrain, Ethan pointed toward a distant mountain range, the silhouettes of jagged peaks visible against the starry sky. There's an old outpost up there. It's been abandoned for years, but we can rest there. Maybe find some supplies. Aylin didn't question him. She knew he was right. They needed to find shelter, a place where they could regroup and plan their next move. The journey ahead would be long, and the road would be filled with danger. But for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Aylin felt the tiniest spark of hope.